Hi. The question of whether the United States has the right to impose embargoes on other countries is steeped in a complex interplay of international law, diplomatic relations, national security interests, and historical precedent. To unpack this issue, it is essential to delve into the foundational principles that govern international relations and the specific contexts in which the U.S. has employed economic sanctions and embargoes. At the core of the U.S. rationale for imposing embargoes lies the concept of national security. The United States, as a global superpower, has a vested interest in maintaining stability and security both within its borders and around the world. When a foreign government is perceived to pose a direct threat to U.S. interests, whether through military aggression, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, or support for terrorism, an embargo can be seen as a legitimate tool to mitigate that threat. For instance, the embargo against North Korea is justified by the U.S. government as a necessary measure to curb the regime's nuclear ambitions and to protect the security of not just the United States, but also its allies in the region. Furthermore, the U.S. often frames its embargoes within the context of promoting human rights and democracy. In cases where governments are engaged in gross human rights violations, such as the systematic oppression of their citizens or acts of genocide, the U.S. may impose economic sanctions as a means of expressing disapproval and pressuring those governments to change their behavior. The embargo against Cuba, for example, has been justified on the grounds of the Cuban government's human rights abuses and its refusal to transition to a democratic system. In this sense, the U.S. positions itself as a moral authority, using embargoes as a tool to encourage positive change in other nations. However, the application of embargoes raises significant ethical and practical questions. Critics argue that these measures often disproportionately affect the civilian population rather than the intended political elite. In the case of Cuba, for instance, the embargo has led to widespread hardship among ordinary Cubans, restricting access to food, medicine, and other essential goods. This raises the moral dilemma of whether it is justifiable to impose suffering on innocent civilians in the hopes of prompting political change. The effectiveness of embargoes is also a contentious issue. Many argue that they rarely achieve their intended goals and can instead entrench the resolve of targeted regimes, leading to a cycle of suffering without resolution. International law also plays a crucial role in the discourse surrounding U.S. embargoes. The United Nations Charter allows for economic sanctions, but these must be imposed in accordance with international law and typically require the backing of the international community. The unilateral imposition of embargoes by the U.S. without UN approval, as seen in the case of Iraq in the 1990s, has sparked debates about legality and legitimacy. Critics contend that such actions violate the principles of state sovereignty and non-interference in the internal affairs of other nations. The U.S. argues, however, that it is acting within its rights as a sovereign nation, especially when it believes that international bodies are failing to address threats to peace and security. Moreover, the geopolitical landscape significantly influences the U.S. approach to embargoes. The Cold War era saw the U.S. and the Soviet Union engaging in a series of proxy conflicts, with both superpowers using economic sanctions as a means of exerting influence over smaller nations. In this context, the U.S. often justified embargoes as a way to contain communism and promote capitalism and democracy. Today, the rise of new global powers and shifting alliances complicates this narrative. The U.S. continues to wield embargoes as a tool of foreign policy, but it must navigate a more multipolar world where other nations may challenge its authority and legitimacy. The U.S. also employs embargoes as a means of enforcing international norms and agreements. For example, the sanctions imposed on Iran were largely justified on the grounds of that nation's non-compliance with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, concerning its nuclear program. In this scenario, the U.S. views itself as upholding international agreements and ensuring that countries adhere to established norms regarding nuclear proliferation. This perspective aligns with the broader principle that nations have a responsibility to act in accordance with international law and agreements, and that failure to do so may warrant collective action, including sanctions. In addition to these considerations, the U.S. often collaborates with allies to impose embargoes, thereby strengthening the legitimacy of its actions. Multilateral sanctions, such as those coordinated through the United Nations or with European partners, can enhance the effectiveness of embargoes and present a united front against perceived threats. This collaborative approach not only amplifies the economic impact of sanctions but also reinforces the idea that the U.S. is acting in concert with the international community rather than unilaterally imposing its will. Despite these justifications, the debate over the right of the U.S. to impose embargoes remains contentious. Critics argue that such measures often serve more as tools of political leverage than genuine efforts to promote peace and stability. The case of Venezuela serves as a poignant example. The U.S. has imposed a series of sanctions aimed at the Maduro regime, ostensibly to restore democracy and alleviate the humanitarian crisis. However, the Venezuelan government has used these sanctions to rally domestic support by portraying itself as a victim of U.S. imperialism, complicating the situation further and raising questions about the efficacy of such measures. The historical context also plays a significant role in shaping perceptions of U.S. embargoes. The legacy of the Cold War, coupled with the U.S.'s position as a global leader, means that its actions are often viewed through a lens of skepticism. Countries that have been subject to U.S. sanctions may view them as acts of aggression rather than legitimate responses to threats. This perception can foster resentment and lead to a breakdown in diplomatic relations, making it even more challenging to achieve the desired outcomes. Additionally, the evolving nature of global trade and economics complicates the effectiveness of embargoes. In an increasingly interconnected world, the ability of countries to circumvent sanctions through alternative trade partnerships poses a significant challenge. Nations that are subject to U.S. embargoes may seek to strengthen ties with other countries, thereby diminishing the impact of the sanctions. This reality necessitates a re-evaluation of how embargoes are employed and whether they remain a viable tool for achieving foreign policy objectives. As technology continues to advance, the methods of enforcing embargoes are also evolving. Cybersecurity and digital currencies present new challenges for the U.S. in terms of monitoring compliance and enforcing sanctions. The rise of cryptocurrencies, for instance, allows sanctioned countries to engage in trade and finance without relying on traditional banking systems, complicating the U.S. government's ability to enforce its embargoes effectively. This technological evolution raises questions about the future of economic sanctions and whether they can adapt to the changing landscape. In conclusion, the question of whether the U.S. has the right to impose embargoes on other countries is multifaceted and deeply rooted in a combination of national security, ethical considerations, international law, and historical context. While the U.S. often justifies its actions as necessary for protecting its interests and promoting global stability, the consequences of these embargoes can be far-reaching and complex. The efficacy and morality of such measures continue to be debated, highlighting the need for a nuanced understanding of the implications of economic sanctions in an increasingly interconnected world. Ultimately, the right to impose embargoes must be weighed against the potential for unintended consequences and the ethical responsibility to minimize harm to innocent civilians. As global dynamics shift and new challenges emerge, the U.S. must navigate this delicate balance with care, considering not only its own interests but also the broader implications for international relations and global stability.